You know that feeling when you're being watched? That prickle on the back of your neck? The way shadows seem to shift just outside your peripheral vision? Most of the time, we dismiss it. Tell ourselves it's nothing. But what happens when that feeling follows you home? What happens when it settles into your childhood bedroom, makes itself comfortable in the place you once felt safest? Tonight, I'm sharing 3 stories about students who brought something back from college, something that wasn't supposed to come home. Welcome back to another episode of our paranormal journey together. I'm your host, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you who've been sharing these stories with friends, leaving reviews, and most importantly, trusting me with your own experiences. The response to last week's episode about haunted dorm rooms was incredible. Your messages, your own college stories, they've filled my inbox, and honestly, they've kept me up at night in the best possible way. Speaking of college experiences, that brings us to tonight's episode. Sarah from Phoenix reached out after hearing that dorm room episode. She said, "You need to hear what happened when I came home for winter break my sophomore year." And after our 3-hour phone call, I knew she was right. But Sarah's story isn't alone. Tonight we have 3 encounters that started on college campuses and followed students home. 3 stories that prove sometimes the scariest thing about going away to school isn't homesickness, it's what comes back with you.
This first story comes from Marcus, a 20-year-old business major at University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Marcus grew up in a small town outside Birmingham, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest excitement on Friday night is the high school football game. Going to UA was his first real taste of independence. Fall semester of his sophomore year, 2019, Marcus was assigned a single room in Riverside East, one of the older dorms on campus. He'd specifically requested a single after a nightmare freshman roommate situation. You know the type. The guy who never did laundry, brought dates back at 3 a.m., and ate your food without asking. So Marcus was thrilled to have his own space, room 318, overlooking the quad. Small but cozy, with that vintage dorm charm that comes from decades of students calling it home. The first few weeks were perfect. He could study when he wanted, sleep when he needed, and most importantly, he had complete privacy. That's when he first heard his roommate. Marcus was studying for a midterm, probably around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. The campus was unusually quiet. Most students were either cramming in the library or already asleep. He had his textbook open, highlighter in hand, when he heard it. The sound of someone moving around in the room next door. Except there was no room next door. Marcus's room was at the end of the hall.
He tried to rationalize it. Old building, probably just pipes settling, maybe someone in the room above. But the sounds were too specific. Footsteps, the scrape of a chair being pulled out, the soft thud of books being dropped on a desk. Marcus pressed his ear to the wall. The sounds were definitely coming from the other side, from a space that, according to the building blueprint, shouldn't exist. The next morning, he mentioned it to his RA, Jake, during their regular check-in. Jake was a senior, laid-back guy who'd lived in Riverside East for 3 years. When Marcus described the sounds, Jake's expression shifted. He got quiet, looked down at his clipboard. "Room 318, Jake muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "I was hoping we wouldn't have this conversation." Turns out, Marcus wasn't the first student to report sounds from the non-existent room next door. In fact, there had been a room there, room 320, but it was sealed off in 1987 after what Jake described as an incident. "What kind of incident?" Marcus pressed. Jake hesitated. "Student named David Reeves, senior year, spring semester, found dead in that room under circumstances that, well, let's just say the university decided it was better to seal it up than try to rent it out again. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Dead how? Officially, heart attack. But David was 21, completely healthy. And the room... Jake shook his head. Room was torn apart from the inside, like someone had been fighting for their life. That night, Marcus couldn't focus on studying. Every small sound made him look up, listening for movement from the sealed room. Around midnight, it started again. Footsteps, but this time they seemed more agitated, pacing back and forth, faster than before. Then, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. It went on for nearly an hour. Marcus grabbed his phone and started recording. The audio was faint, but it was there. Scratching, occasional thuds, and underneath it all, something that sounded almost like whispered conversation. Too quiet to make out words, but definitely human voices. He played the recording for his girlfriend Tessa the next day. She listened with growing concern, then looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before. "Marcus," she said quietly, "that's not just scratching. Listen again." She rewound to a specific section. In the background, barely audible, was what sounded like someone spelling out letters. S-O-M-E-N-O-E. Then a pause. H-E-L-P. Tessa grabbed his hand. "We need to tell someone." But when they took the recording to campus security, the officer listened politely and then gave them the standard response about old buildings making noise. He did mention, almost as an afterthought, that they'd had similar reports from room 318 over the years. "What happened to the previous students?" Marcus asked. "They all requested room transfers, usually within a month."
Marcus decided he wasn't going to be run out of his room by some ghost story. He was a rational person, a business major for crying out loud. But his determination wavered when he came back from dinner one evening in late October and found his room had been rearranged. Not ransacked, not burglarized, rearranged. His desk had been moved to face the shared wall with the sealed room. His bed had been pushed against the opposite wall. His textbooks were stacked in a perfect pyramid on the floor. And on his desk, written in what looked like dust, were two words: "I'm here." That was when Marcus called his parents. "Mom," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I need to come home for a weekend. Something's wrong with my room." His mother, Linda, had raised 3 boys and knew when one of them was genuinely scared. She didn't ask questions. "Pack a bag. Your father's already in the car." When they arrived that night, Marcus's dad, Robert, insisted on staying in the room to see what all the fuss was about. Marcus tried to protest, but Robert was stubborn. "Son, I've lived through Vietnam and 40 years of marriage. I think I can handle a noisy dorm room." Robert lasted exactly 3 hours. He burst out of the room at 2 a.m., pale and shaking, and found Marcus and Linda in the lobby. "We're leaving. Now." In the car, Robert was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I heard a young man crying and asking for help. And when I tried to respond, when I asked if he was okay, the crying stopped. But I could feel him listening, waiting." Marcus never went back to room 318. The university allowed him to transfer to a different dorm without question, which only confirmed his suspicions that they were well aware of the problem. But here's the thing that still bothers Marcus to this day. When he was cleaning out his stuff with his parents' help, they found something wedged behind his moved desk. A yearbook photo. aged and worn. The name underneath read David Reeves, class of 1987. David was smiling in the photo, looked like any normal college senior. But someone had written across the bottom in faded ink, "Someone help me understand why I can't leave." Marcus keeps that photo in a drawer at home. He's never shown it to anyone except Tessa. And now in sharing this story to us. Because sometimes he says he still hears scratching sounds. Not in his new dorm room. Not in his childhood bedroom when he visits home. The scratching comes from inside his backpack, where he keeps his college notebooks. And sometimes late at night when he's studying, he finds new words written in the margins. Always the same handwriting. Always the same message. I'm still here.
Marcus's story raises so many questions, doesn't it? About the spaces we occupy, the energy that gets left behind, and what happens when past and present collide in ways we can't fully understand. But sometimes, what follows you home from college isn't tied to a specific place. Sometimes it's something you picked up along the way, something that saw an opportunity and took it. Our next story comes from Elena, a graduate student at University of New Mexico, and it involves a very different kind of attachment. Elena's experience reminds us that not all college learning happens in the classroom. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the things that teach themselves to you. Elena Vasquez was pursuing her master's in anthropology at UNM, specializing in Southwestern folklore and indigenous traditions. She was particularly interested in the intersection of academic research and living cultural practices, the kind of work that requires careful balance between scholarly curiosity and cultural respect. In her second year, fall 2020, Elena was taking a seminar called Ritual and Reality in Native American Traditions. The professor, Dr. Martinez, was known for his unconventional approach to teaching. Instead of just reading about ceremonies and beliefs, he encouraged students to seek out primary sources, to interview community elders, to witness, when appropriate and permitted, actual traditional practices. "You can't understand a living culture from dusty books alone," Dr. Martinez would say, "but you must approach with humility, always humility." Elena took this advice to heart. She reached out to several Pueblo communities, explaining her research interests and asking for guidance. Most were politely uninterested, understandably protective of their traditions. But in October, she received a call from an elderly woman named Maria Santos from a small village outside Santa Fe. "I heard you're asking the right questions. Maybe it's time someone learned to ask them properly." Maria invited Elena to attend a series of informal gatherings where community members shared stories, discussed traditional healing practices, and occasionally demonstrated certain protective rituals. Not sacred ceremonies, Maria was careful to distinguish, but educational practices that could help Elena understand the world view behind the traditions she was studying. Elena was honored and approached each gathering with deep respect. She took notes sparingly, asked permission before writing anything down, and always brought offerings of food or tobacco, as Maria instructed.
The gatherings were usually held in Maria's living room on Thursday evenings. Elena was the only non-community member initially, but by November, Maria had invited 2 other graduate students who'd approached her with similar respect for proper protocol. There was Thomas, a PhD candidate in religious studies from UC Berkeley, and Sarah. Yes, the same Sarah from Phoenix who'd reached out to me initially. Sarah was studying psychology with a focus on cultural healing practices. The 3 of them formed what they jokingly called their study group, though they quickly learned it was anything but academic. Maria's teaching method involved storytelling, demonstration, and what she called protective awareness. She taught them to recognize different types of spiritual energy, to understand the signs of spiritual imbalance,
and most importantly, to protect themselves when dealing with forces they didn't fully understand. In your universities, Maria would say, you learn to analyze everything, to break it down, to question. This is good for some things, but some things cannot be broken down. Some things must be respected whole, or they become dangerous. She showed them how to prepare protective sage blends, how to recognize spaces where negative energy had accumulated, and how to cleanse themselves after encountering spiritual disturbance. Elena found it fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but she also found herself genuinely believing in the practical value of what Maria taught. The first sign of trouble came in late November. Elena had been practicing the protective techniques Maria taught, burning sage in her apartment, creating what Maria called spiritual boundaries. But she'd also been pushing boundaries in her research, visiting historical sites known for tragic events, collecting stories about spiritual encounters that most academics dismissed as folklore. One Thursday evening, Maria took one look at Elena and shook her head. "Mija, you've been careless. You're carrying something that doesn't belong to you." Maria could see it before Elena felt it. Something had attached itself to Elena during her research, something drawn to her openness and academic curiosity. Maria described it as a fragment of unresolved trauma, a piece of spiritual disturbance that had been looking for someone to carry it. "This is what happens," Maria explained, "when you study tragedy without proper protection. The pain, the anger, the confusion, it looks for someone who will listen, who will care. And you, Elena, you care very much." Maria worked with Elena for several weeks, teaching her cleansing rituals, helping her identify when the attachment was influencing her thoughts and emotions. It was subtle at first: unusual dreams, moments of inexplicable sadness, a tendency to obsess over the more disturbing aspects of her research. But it was working. By mid-December, Elena felt lighter, more like herself. Maria had taught her to recognize the difference between her own emotions and the feelings that belonged to the attachment. The cleansing rituals were helping her establish boundaries. That's when Elena made her first mistake. Winter break was coming, and she mentioned to Maria that she'd be going home to Phoenix for 3 weeks. Maria's expression grew serious. "No, mija, not yet. The cleansing isn't complete. If you take this home with you, it will spread to your family. It will root itself in a place where you feel safe, and then it will be much harder to remove." But Elena had already bought her plane ticket, and her parents were expecting her. She'd been away from home for months, focused intensely on her studies. She needed the break, needed the comfort of her childhood bedroom, her mother's cooking, her father's terrible jokes. She promised Maria she'd continue the cleansing rituals at home, that she'd be careful. Maria reluctantly agreed to teach her a portable protection routine, but Elena could see the worry in the older woman's eyes. "Some things should not go home with you," Maria warned. "Home is where we're most vulnerable, where our defenses are down. Promise me you'll call if anything feels wrong." Elena promised, but she didn't understand yet how wrong things could get. The flight to Phoenix was unremarkable, but Elena felt uneasy as soon as she walked into her parents' house. The attachment, which had been quiet and manageable in Albuquerque, suddenly felt stronger, more active, like it was excited to be in a new environment. Her childhood bedroom felt different. The posters and books and familiar objects were all there, but the space felt charged somehow, like the air before a thunderstorm. Elena tried the cleansing ritual Maria had taught her, burning sage and setting protective intentions, but her parents complained about the smoke. "Mija, what is this? Why are you burning plants in your room?" Elena tried to explain about her research, about learning traditional practices, but she could see the confusion and slight concern in her parents' eyes. They were proud of her academic success, but worried about these new interests that seemed so far from the practical, rational daughter they'd raised. She stopped the cleansing rituals to keep the peace, telling herself she could manage for just 3 weeks. That was her second mistake. The attachment grew stronger every day. Elena found herself fixated on tragic news stories, spending hours researching historical disasters and unsolved murders. She was drawn to the saddest, most disturbing content she could find, consuming it with an appetite that felt foreign but irresistible. Her sleep became restless, filled with dreams about people she'd never met, places she'd never been. Always the dreams involved someone crying for help, someone lost and unable to find their way home. Elena would wake up exhausted, emotionally drained, but unable to stop herself from seeking out more disturbing content during the day. Her parents noticed the change. Elena had always been serious about her studies, but now she seemed obsessed, unhealthy. She barely ate, spent all her time alone in her room, and when she did interact with family, she was irritable and distant.
By the second week of break, the attachment had spread beyond Elena. Her younger brother, Miguel, started having nightmares. Her parents found themselves arguing about trivial things, feeling inexplicably depressed and anxious. The whole house felt heavy, oppressive. Carmen, Elena's mother, was a practical woman who didn't believe in spiritual nonsense, but she knew something was wrong with her daughter. She did what any concerned mother would do. She called Elena's advisor at the university. Dr. Martinez listened to Carmen's concerns and then asked to speak with Elena. When he heard about her work with Maria Santos, about the attachment Maria had identified, his tone became serious. Elena, why didn't you tell me about this? Maria Santos isn't just the community elder. She's one of the most respected spiritual healers in the Southwest. If she told you not to go home, you should have listened. Dr. Martinez connected Elena with Maria by phone that evening. When Elena described what was happening, Maria didn't hesitate. "I'm driving to Phoenix tomorrow," Maria said. "This cannot wait until you return to school." Maria arrived the next day with her grandson, David, who served as her assistant in more serious spiritual work. They spent 2 hours with Elena and her family, explaining what had happened, what needed to be done. "The attachment feeds on emotional pain," Maria told Elena's parents. Elena's academic curiosity opened a door, but her isolation at home, her disconnection from proper spiritual protection, allowed it to grow strong. Now it's affecting all of you. The cleansing ritual Maria performed was unlike anything Elena had learned in their Thursday evening gatherings. It was more intensive, more serious, involving the whole family and requiring them to confront their own spiritual vulnerabilities. The ritual worked, but Maria warned that the effects would take time to fully fade. The attachment was gone, but it had left traces, emotional scars, spiritual sensitivity that Elena would carry with her. "You cannot go back to studying these things the same way," Maria told her. "You've learned that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Curiosity without respect opens doors that shouldn't be opened." Elena returned to school with a different approach to her research. She still studies Southwestern folklore, but now she works exclusively within proper cultural protocols, always with community guidance, always with appropriate spiritual protection. Her parents' house recovered its normal energy, but the experience changed the whole family. They have more respect now for things they don't understand, more awareness of the spiritual dimension of life that they'd always dismissed as superstition. Elena finished her master's thesis on the importance of traditional spiritual practices in anthropological research. She now works with communities to help other researchers understand proper protocol for studying living spiritual traditions. but she still has to be careful. The attachment is gone, but it left her more sensitive to spiritual disturbance. She can sense when others are carrying similar burdens, can recognize the signs of spiritual attachment that most people miss. It's a gift and a responsibility that she never expected to gain from her college education. But as Maria taught her, some lessons can only be learned by living them. Stories like Elena's remind us how much our education extends beyond textbooks and classrooms, don't they? Sometimes the most important lessons are the ones we never intended to learn. I want to take a moment here to thank some incredible people who make these conversations possible. First, to Maria. Yes, that's her real name, and yes, she gave me permission to share Elena's story with her real identity. Maria wanted people to understand the importance of approaching spiritual traditions with proper respect and protection. To all of you who've been sharing your college experiences, your encounters with the unexplained during those transformative years, please keep them coming. Your stories matter, and they help others feel less alone in their own experiences. If you're enjoying these longer format episodes, please consider leaving a review. It helps other people find us, and it helps me understand what resonates most with our growing community. You can find us on all social platforms. Just search for our show name. And speaking of community, I have some exciting news to share next week about a project we're developing to help people connect with others who've had similar experiences. More details coming soon. But right now, let's return to our college stories, because we have one more tale about something following a student home. And this one? Well, this one is different from anything we've shared before.
This shorter story comes from one of you, a listener named James, who emailed after our series on university hauntings. James was a junior at Middlebury College in Vermont, studying English literature with a focus on 19th century Gothic fiction. Fitting, considering what happened to him. James spent most of his free time in the college's old library, a beautiful stone building that had been serving students since 1900. He loved the atmosphere, the smell of old books, the way afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, the sense of scholarly tradition that seemed to permeate every corner. His favorite spot was a reading table on the third floor, tucked back in a section devoted to rare books and special collections. It was quiet there, off the beaten path, perfect for deep focus on his thesis research. In November of his junior year, James was researching Gothic literature's influence on American horror writing. He'd been spending long hours in his favorite corner, surrounded by first editions and scholarly journals, when he noticed something odd about his library account. James always kept meticulous records of the books he checked out, partly for his research, partly because he was the kind of person who liked organized systems. But when he logged into his library account online, he found books listed that he'd never checked out. Old books, really old, some dating back to the 1800s, including several that he knew were kept in locked special collections. Books about spiritualism, seances, communication with the dead. The kind of texts that perfectly complemented his Gothic literature research, but that he'd never actually requested. The weird part was that the books were listed as returned on dates when James had clear memories of being elsewhere, visiting home, taking exams in other buildings. Someone was checking out books on his account and returning them without him ever seeing the physical copies. James assumed it was a computer glitch and went to the circulation desk to report the error. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a woman in her 60s who'd worked at the college for decades. When James showed her the list of mysterious books, her expression changed. "Oh," she said quietly, looking at the screen. "It's happening again." Mrs. Patterson explained that James wasn't the first student to experience this phenomenon. Every few years, a student who spent significant time in the rare book section would report similar incidents. Books appearing on their account, always related to spiritualism and communication with the dead, always returned at times when the student had alibis elsewhere. "We call him the ghost scholar," Mrs. Patterson said with a slight smile. "Legend has it that there was a student here in the 1920s, a young man named Theodore Whitman, who was obsessed with proving that consciousness survived death. He spent years researching spiritualism, trying to find scientific evidence for communication with deceased persons. Theodore had been working on his senior thesis when he died suddenly of pneumonia in the winter of 1924. He was found in his favorite study spot, the same corner table where James preferred to work. His final research notes were scattered around him, along with several books about seances and spirit communication that were never officially checked out. Theodore's body was found, but his library books were never returned," Mrs. Patterson continued. "And ever since then, students who use his old table sometimes find their accounts credited with his research materials." James was fascinated rather than frightened. As an English major studying Gothic literature, he appreciated the poetic justice of a ghost scholar continuing his research through the library accounts of living students. He decided to lean into the experience. When he went home for winter break, he packed carefully, but left his library card on his desk in his dorm room. If Theodore wanted to continue checking out books, James figured he might as well make it easy for him. James spent winter break at his parents' house in Burlington, Vermont, about an hour from campus. But every few days, he'd check his library account online. Sure enough, new books appeared, always related to spiritualism, always returned within 24 hours. His parents thought he was making it up until James showed them the online records, complete with timestamps showing books being checked out and returned while James was sitting in their living room. When James returned to campus in January, he left a note at Theodore's old table. "Thanks for the reading recommendations. Hope you're finding the answers you were looking for." The next time James checked his account, he found one final entry, a book about eternal friendship, checked out and returned on the same day. After that, the mysterious library activity stopped. James graduated the following year with a thesis that incorporated some of Theodore's research approaches. And sometimes, he says, when he visits the Middlebury Library as an alumnus, he still leaves books about Gothic literature and supernatural themes on Theodore's old table, just in case a fellow scholar wants to continue the conversation. James's story has a sweetness to it, doesn't it? A reminder that not all supernatural encounters are frightening. Sometimes they're about connection, about the continuation of scholarly passion beyond the boundaries of physical existence. But our final story tonight takes us back to the darker side of things that follow a student's home. This last account comes from Sarah, the same Sarah I mentioned at the beginning, who first reached out after hearing about haunted dorm rooms. Sarah's experience happened during her senior year at Arizona State University, and it's the kind of story that made me understand why she insisted I needed to hear it. Because sometimes what follows you home from college isn't a ghost, isn't a spiritual attachment, isn't even something supernatural in the traditional sense. Sometimes it's something much more complex, much more personal, and much more difficult to understand. Sarah Chin was a senior at Arizona State University, majoring in psychology with a focus on abnormal behavior and personality disorders. She'd chosen this field partly out of academic interest, partly because she'd grown up with a younger brother who struggled with severe mental health issues. She wanted to understand the human mind, to help people who were dealing with the kind of psychological pain her family had witnessed firsthand. Sarah was a good student, disciplined and focused, but she'd always been what her friends called intense. She had a tendency to obsess over her coursework, to dive so deeply into case studies and research that she sometimes lost perspective.
Her professors appreciated her dedication, but her friends worried that she was losing herself in other people's psychological problems. In the fall semester of her senior year, 2019, Sarah was taking a seminar called Dissociative Disorders and Multiple Personality. The professor, Dr. Reynolds, was a practicing therapist who brought real case studies into the classroom, with patient consent and proper anonymization, of course. The class was small, only 12 students, and the material was heavy. They studied cases of dissociative identity disorder, depersonalization, derealization, conditions where people lose touch with their sense of self, where the boundaries of identity become fluid and uncertain. Sarah found the material fascinating, but disturbing. She'd always had a strong sense of who she was, prided herself on her self-awareness and emotional stability. Reading about people who lost that foundational sense of self, who experienced their own identity as fractured or unreal, was both academically interesting and personally unsettling.
For her final project, Sarah chose to research depersonalization disorder, the condition where people feel detached from themselves, like they're watching their life from outside their body, like they're not quite real. She interviewed several people who lived with this condition, trying to understand the subjective experience of feeling disconnected from your own identity. The interviews were intense. Sarah would spend hours listening to people describe the sensation of looking in mirrors and not recognizing themselves, of feeling like their hands weren't their hands, of going through daily life with a persistent sense that nothing was quite real. One interview in particular affected her deeply. A woman named Lisa described how depersonalization felt like living inside a glass box where you can see everything happening to your life, but you can't quite reach it, can't quite feel it as your own. Sarah threw herself into the research with characteristic intensity. She read everything she could find about depersonalization, watched documentaries, joined online forums where people discussed their experiences. She wanted to truly understand what it felt like to lose your sense of self. That's when she started having what she called research empathy episodes. Sarah would be conducting interviews or reading case studies, trying to really understand the subjective experience of depersonalization, when she'd suddenly feel detached from herself, like she was watching herself conduct the interview from a distance, like her own voice sounded foreign and unfamiliar. At first, she assumed it was normal, just the psychological equivalent of medical students thinking they have every disease they study. She mentioned it to Dr. Reynolds, who nodded knowingly. It's common for psychology students to experience temporary symptoms related to their coursework, he said. Just maintain some boundaries. Don't let the research consume you. But Sarah found it hard to maintain those boundaries. The more she learned about dissociation, the more she wanted to understand it completely, to experience it from the inside. By November, Sarah's research empathy episodes were becoming more frequent and more intense. She'd be in the middle of normal activities, eating dinner, talking with friends, walking across campus, when suddenly she'd feel like she was watching herself from outside her body. She started keeping a journal to track these episodes, analyzing them with the same academic rigor she applied to her coursework. She noted triggers, duration, intensity levels, trying to understand the pattern. But the journal entries began to worry her. Reading back over them, she noticed that her handwriting looked different during episodes, that her vocabulary and sentence structure changed. It was still recognizably her writing, but altered somehow, like a slightly different version of herself was holding the pen. Her roommate, Jennifer, started commenting on Sarah's behavior. "You seem different lately," Jennifer said. "More distant, like you're not quite present, even when you're sitting right there." Sarah brushed off the concern, but privately, she was beginning to worry. The episodes were lasting longer, happening more frequently.
And they weren't just happening during her research anymore, they were bleeding into every aspect of her life. She made an appointment with the campus counseling center, thinking that talking to a professional might help her process what she was experiencing. But during the session, she had one of the most intense episodes yet. Dr. Collins, the counselor, was asking Sarah about her stress levels when Sarah suddenly felt herself detached completely. She watched from what felt like a distance as her body answered the counselor's questions, but the responses didn't feel like her own thoughts, her own words. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she heard herself say, but the voice seemed to come from someone else, like I'm being replaced by someone who looks like me but isn't me.
Dr. Collins recommended that Sarah take a break from her intensive research, maybe spend some time away from campus to regain perspective. Winter break was coming up anyway, so Sarah decided to go home to Phoenix early before her final exams. She packed carefully, including all her research materials and journals. She wanted to continue working on her project at home, but in a more relaxed environment, surrounded by family and familiar surroundings. The flight home was difficult. Sarah felt detached for most of the journey, watching herself go through the motions of traveling, but feeling no connection to the experience. She kept looking at her hands, her reflection in the airplane window, trying to convince herself that this was really her body, her life. Her parents, David and Linda, picked her up at the airport. They immediately noticed that something was wrong. Sarah seemed distant, distracted, like she was only partially present. "How's school, sweetheart?" her mother asked during the drive home. Sarah heard herself answer, providing updates about her classes and research, but she felt like she was listening to someone else's conversation. The words were coming out of her mouth, but they didn't feel like her words, her thoughts. Sarah's childhood bedroom felt foreign to her, like a museum display of someone else's life. The posters on the walls, the books on the shelves, the photos with friends, everything looked familiar, but felt unconnected to her current sense of self. She continued her research at home, spending long hours in her room reading case studies and reviewing her interview notes. But the detachment episodes were getting worse, lasting for hours at a time. Her parents became increasingly concerned when Sarah stopped eating regular meals, stopped participating in family conversations. She'd sit at the dinner table, but seemed to be watching the family from a distance, like she wasn't quite part of the scene. "Sarah," her father said one evening, "we're worried about you. You seem like you're not really here with us." Sarah wanted to explain, but how do you tell your parents that you're not sure you exist, that you feel like you're watching someone else live your life? Instead, she just nodded and said she was tired from school stress. But the crisis came 3 days before Christmas. Sarah was in her bathroom, brushing her teeth before bed, when she looked up at the mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back at her. Not in a metaphorical way, she literally didn't recognize her own reflection. The face in the mirror looked like a stranger, someone who happened to resemble her but wasn't her. Sarah raised her hand to touch her face, and the reflection mimicked the movement, but there was a disconnect, like watching someone else's movements through a window. She stood there for nearly an hour, staring at this stranger in the mirror who moved when she moved, who seemed to be wearing her clothes, living in her bedroom, but who wasn't her. Sarah's mother found her still standing in front of the bathroom mirror at 2 a.m. Sarah was crying, but she seemed unaware of the tears, like she was watching someone else cry. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "I can't find myself. I don't know where I went." Linda had worked as a nurse for 20 years. She'd seen psychological crises before, and she recognized that her daughter needed immediate professional help. They drove to the emergency room that night. The ER psychiatrist, Dr. Patel,
listened to Sarah's description of her experiences with growing concern. After a thorough evaluation, she diagnosed Sarah with severe depersonalization disorder, likely triggered by her intensive research into dissociative conditions. "It's more common than you might think," Dr. Patel explained to Sarah and her parents. "Psychology students sometimes develop temporary symptoms related to their area of study, but Sarah's case is severe because she immersed herself so completely in trying to understand the subjective experience of dissociation." Dr. Patel explained that Sarah had essentially trained her brain to dissociate by repeatedly trying to empathize with the experiences she was researching. The intense focus on understanding what it felt like to be disconnected from yourself had created actual disconnection. "The mind is more suggestible than we like to think," Dr. Patel said. "When you spend months trying to understand what it feels like to not feel real, sometimes the brain obliges by creating that exact experience." Sarah spent the rest of winter break in intensive therapy, working to re-establish connection with her sense of self. It was slow, difficult work. She had to essentially retrain her brain to recognize her own identity, to feel present in her own life. The therapy involved grounding techniques, exercises designed to connect her with her physical senses, with the present moment, with her own body. She practiced looking in mirrors and actively recognizing herself, saying her name aloud, listing facts about her identity and history. Sarah returned to school for spring semester, but she switched her thesis topic to something less personally triggering. She finished her psychology degree, but decided against graduate school in clinical psychology. The experience had taught her that some people are too empathetic, too susceptible to absorbing others' psychological states. She now works as a research coordinator for a nonprofit organization focused on mental health advocacy. She uses her experience with depersonalization to help design better support systems for people with dissociative disorders, but she maintains careful boundaries to protect her own psychological well-being. The most lasting impact of Sarah's experience is her understanding of how permeable the boundaries of identity really are. She learned that the self we take for granted, that solid sense of being who we are, is actually quite fragile, quite vulnerable to disruption. "I brought something home from college," Sarah told me during our interview. "But it wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was a different version of myself, one that I'd accidentally created through trying too hard to understand experiences that weren't my own." Sarah still has to be careful about mirrors sometimes. Occasionally, usually when she's stressed or tired, she'll catch her reflection and feel that brief moment of non-recognition, that sensation of looking at a stranger. But now she has tools to ground herself, to remember who she is and reclaim her sense of self. Her advice to psychology students is simple. Empathy is a gift, but it can also be dangerous. When you're studying the human mind, you have to remember to protect your own.
4 stories tonight about students who brought something home from college. Marcus and his ghostly roommate who wouldn't stay gone. Elena and the spiritual attachment that spread to her family. James and his scholarly ghost who just wanted to continue his research. And Sarah, who brought home a fragmented version of herself. Each story reminds us that our college years are about more than academic learning. They're about transformation, about opening ourselves to new experiences and ideas. But sometimes, in our eagerness to learn and grow, we open ourselves to things we're not prepared to handle. The boundaries between self and other, between academic knowledge and lived experience, between the past and present, these boundaries are more fragile than we like to think. And sometimes, when we're young and curious and far from home, we accidentally cross lines we didn't even know existed.
If you're currently in college, if you're exploring new ideas and pushing the boundaries of your understanding, remember to take care of yourself. Not all learning is safe. Not all knowledge comes without cost. And some experiences, once invited in, are very difficult to uninvite. To everyone who shared their stories for tonight's episode, Marcus, Elena, James, and especially Sarah, thank you for trusting me with these deeply personal experiences. Your willingness to share helps others feel less alone in their own encounters with the unexplained. And to all of you listening, whether you're current students, alumni, or just people who remember what it felt like to be young and searching for answers, keep sharing your stories. Keep looking out for each other. Keep questioning, but keep protecting yourselves too. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and remember, not everything that follows you home from college is meant to stay.